It may be hard to believe right now, but the earliest enforced immigration restrictions passed in the United States targeted Chinese. These were the Chinese exclusion laws, which were in effect 1882 to 1943, and were passed against a group that at the time only constituted about 0.2% of the national population. The context in which this very strong hostility to Chinese and concerns about immigration arose was that during the 1870s, the United States was experiencing very serious economic depression. This also combined with California's status as a swing state in presidential elections. And at that time, most Chinese were in California, and California was very concerned about its Chinese problem. And in pursuit of California's votes and the very strong feelings of powerful parties within California, particularly the labor movement, national politicians took up the cause of the anti-Chinese movement, and the legislation was passed with a wide majority in 1882. The idea of extending border control within the United States, not just to try to police at the actual borders, the ocean borders or the land borders, and also try to identify those who had already entered the United States, were living and working in the United States, but who had entered illegally, and then also to deport them, to remove the problem, also began with Chinese. In 1892, Congress passed the Geary Act, which required that all Chinese who had entered the United States legally carry a document called a certificate of residence. This is a precursor to the contemporary green cards. All Chinese had to have these documents on hand. If they did not have the document, they were presumed to have entered illegally and were subject to deportation. Entry, the United States really had not policed its border with Mexico. Mexican mobility across that shared border really did not become seen as a problem until the 1920s and 1930s, but the immigration bureaucracy's attention started being drawn to the southern border because they realized that many Chinese were circumventing the Chinese exclusion laws by crossing from the south. And one of the strategies that Chinese did, since the law targeted Chinese as a race, was to disguise themselves as Mexicans. And so they would put on sombreros, they would hide their queues under their hats, they would wear ponchos and walk across the border. And this was very confounding for immigration authorities because they assumed that race could be visually labeled, that you could identify somebody just by looking at them what race they are, and therefore know who had to be targeted for exclusion.
Mostly Irish, building the railway from the East Coast and meeting in Promontory Point, Utah. But even before that, the Chinese were coming here to mine.
Those Chinese immigrants came as part of the gold rush, when prospectors found gold in the hills and streams of the western U.S. and Canada. When the gold rush was over and the railway built, the laborers were no longer welcome.
There was an economic recession in the United States, and the Chinese were asked to go home. You've helped us build the railways, now go home. And unfortunately, many of these workers, there was no home to go to. And they also could not bring their family because they were not citizens. So that's kind of the genesis of Chinatown throughout the United States.
In short, the Chinese explored new ways to get themselves into the United States by disguising themselves as Mexicans. They encountered struggles faced by racism and exchanged cultures with the United States to create the Chinese American culture that exists today.